Good morning, and thank you, Tim, and thank you very much, Alan Press, for the opportunity to talk with you. I am a big part of my time. I actually live in Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm obviously fond of Alan Press, and had the opportunity to work with the Press many years ago when Bio 1 began. So I'm wearing one of my other hats. In fact, one of the hats that I wear all the time is collaboration, and I think that that's really a great thing to be talking about because, in fact, our SHARE project is indeed one of collaboration. So I'm trying, following on the very fine presentations by both Fred and Howard, I probably don't need to say a whole lot about background of public access and background of other kinds of activities. So what I'm going to focus on is sort of filling in some of the pieces about the SHARE project, a little bit about how we began, and then focus a bit more on what Howard mentioned was the notification service that is our current activity. The focus of SHARE is the higher education and research community. It's an initiative, essentially collaboration among ARL, the American Association of Universities, and the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And this collaboration is extraordinarily important. We have a vested interest, all of higher education, not just the libraries, but the larger institutions as well, in terms of sharing information about what is being published on our campuses, what is being made available as a result of research. Our goal is actually to figure out what research output exists, how to preserve it, make it accessible and reusable on our campuses to build on that research. So when we're talking about research output in the terms of SHARE, we're talking not just about published articles and data, we're also talking about other kinds of activities that are involved in the research process. So we think much more broadly, perhaps, than just, for example, the OSTP memo, which spoke specifically to publications and data. And we call ourselves SHARE because of it being an ecosystem, which is a much larger, and I think is a wonderful term to think about, especially those folks who are Alan Press, who publish a lot in the ecosystem world, I think. And we leverage that existing ecosystem, the world of identifiers, also a favorite of mine, platforms, transport mechanisms, and all others that SHARE wishes to work with. So how did SHARE come about? Well, there are a number of trends within our community that played a role in the development of SHARE. One was, of course, institutional open access policies, whereby campuses, faculty, governance was passing their own particular policies that spoke to the importance of making the results of their research openly accessible. AAU and ARL had a task force on scholarly communication that was looking at the broader issue of what were the activities in which the research libraries and the their institutions were engaged in, and how could we think about what effect the institution can have on making that much more available and accessible. And one of the topics within that group was indeed institutional repositories. Then there became the funder mandate particular issues, and in particular in 2013, the OSTP memo, when it came out, provided actually an impetus for us to say, oh wow, we ought to move our efforts within the institutional repositories up a notch, and that became kind of thinking of Emeril Lagasse, boom, let's move on this activity, and let's move forward in that particular area. And of course, there were other mandates. There's certainly the most recent omnibus appropriation, and as well as the other private and other funder policies. So all those sort of coalesced to become a reason for us to spend some time thinking about how do we create some sort of large-scale ecosystem within our institutions. And so we looked at higher education leveraging its institutional repositories to serve as this kind of distributed system of preservation, discovery, access, and reuse of research output on terms, and I need to say this explicitly, that are favorable to the Academy. I too have allergies. So the question is, who is SHARE? Well, SHARE is right now a steering group, which includes provost, library directors, CIO, and sponsored research officers. We have a staff support, membership from the AAU, APLU, CNI, SPARC, and NLM is our federal agency liaison. We have some staff, a project manager, one of our colleagues at ARL, technical director, a product community lead, and a development team in process. And we have, and this is really the most important part of SHARE, we have working groups. We have 4 working groups that were set up to look at 4 specific areas that seem to be the most important for us. One was repositories, obviously. If we're going to start leveraging them, we needed to have a community of repository experience that we could work with, people who are managers of and who had a deep experience in their own repository services. We needed the workflow. Because of this issue of how do you think about deposits, specifically responding to the OSTP memo, what is the workflow within the research enterprise? What is it that project investigators do? What is it that the research offices do? How do the librarians fit into that workflow? So it's terribly important that we understand the ways in which different institutions process and handle all of the different elements that go into sponsored research. We, of course, need a technical group, and that group would think about the specific requirements as well as the standards that we would want to have within a system like SHARE. And then, of course, a communications group. How do we reach out to our communities and talk to them about this essentially new idea that we are sharing with them? So the upshot is we put out a draft proposal in June of last year. I woke up the other morning and I said, oh my gosh, it's just been a year. And to think about the very large-scale collaboration and interest that has been generated within our communities in a year is quite amazing. I talk about agencies and how long a process it is to do that. Well, academies take a little while too. So it's really kind of nice to be able to say, man, look at what we've been able to accomplish just within this past year. But this draft policy or draft project idea came out in June of last year, and then became a long conversation within the community about what people liked, what they didn't like. What they said was, boy, that's really stupid of you. And we were able to build a lot of community, get a lot of community information. And essentially that's the way SHARE has been growing. It's organic. It's what things are most important to our community and what can we do for them that would make sense. What arose from those discussions was something like that we're now calling a notification service. And this service is now the first of our components that is underway. And in short terms, we plan for a beta release of this in the fall of 2014 and a full release in the fall of 2015. And that's, you know, as far as systems go, that's what you say right now. I don't know. Maybe things will go faster, maybe they'll go slower, but that's what the plan is right now. We also are looking at 3 other components within the SHARE system. One has to do with discovery or registration. One has to do with discovery and another with aggregation, and I'll talk about each of them. So when we were talking with everybody, it seemed like, about what was important to them regarding this interoperability issue and as far as the OSTP memo, what was the most difficult thing? What was the biggest problem people had to solve? And what it was this difficulty of keeping aware. How am I aware of the release of publications, data sets, and other research outputs? How do I keep track? I mean, it's sort of like anybody. What's the biggest problem you have in your day-to-day life? keeping track, right? And so the notification system became a keeping track kind of operation. There has been, and there probably never will be, but what we wanted to work towards was a single structured way to report research outputs releases in a timely and ubiquitous manner. Now, this research output release is any event that is a result of funding, especially funder mandate funding. And so that was that's our sort of problem statement that we said we could work on. And that was incredibly well received by the community. So yes, this is something that would be of value to us, some way that we could know what is going on in terms of the output, whether they be a sponsored research office, a repository, or even an agency. So the goals are that we would first know that the research output actually exists, and then we would enable some short-term and with high latency activities that the repository managers could identify articles and papers and reports that they could deposit in their repository. And the universities and funding agencies could give administrators the opportunity to be able to determine compliance with any public access policies. So we have a couple of basic needs here that could be met by a notification service. So what are the building blocks right now for this? Well, one of them is here's kind of how it's going to look. There is a source, something happened, there's a place, there's a source, and consumer here is quite general. It can be anybody, it can be a research office, it can be a repository. So consumer is sort of a general word for that. So what happens is that the source, the notification service will both gather information about these research events through both a push protocol and a harvest strategy, so that these sources could push report information into the service, and they could be pushed back out or harvested to those particular consumers. And there could be a way, and there would be a way that consumers can say, all right, what I need to know about is this researcher, this grant, this agency, or the agency could say, I need to know about this researcher, this project, this time frame. There would be a small set of metadata that would in fact be part of this notification service. And again, this is any type of research. It's not limited to publication of articles. It could be the posting of data, deposit of objects within any disciplinary, institutional, or government repository, or any dissemination of materials via research productivity tools, for example, bibliographic software systems, or even professional networks. The sources could include both, or in addition to repositories, could be publishers and academic profiles. As more and more researchers put their information into their profiles, that could be a source of information. And the sources may also be consumers of these events, though the consumers would also include research information systems funding and of course our own shared registry, which I'll talk a little bit about. So the idea is that the source only needs to report new research release once in order to reach whoever needs to reach it. So you plug it into the notification service, and then it just spins out to whoever needs it. And those who want to stay abreast of a particular research activity need only subscribe in some way to this notification service rather than trying to track a whole universe of sources. Now this slide sort of sketches how data sources would interact with the notification service. With respect to push, we want to make it very simple for the sources. Just toss some metadata in a queue and share it to the rest. Now, This can be, as we call it, event metadata, but it could be any resource metadata that a consumer would be interested in. Contextual information is information that is inferred from the context of the report. And the resource metadata is the specific metadata that distinctly identifies the research release event. Now, you're going to say, well, what exactly is there? Well, there's actually an intentional lack of specification regarding the fields we will require here, as we want this, again, to evolve organically as we discuss this with our sources and consumers and as we go through our beta testing. So initially, there could be a limited number of pieces of metadata that go here. It may be a PI's ORCID, a fund rep number, and a DOI. That might be it. That might be all that we need to have in a research release event notification. That would tell you an awful lot of information if everybody was using that sort of stuff. In some other cases, there might be need for more information. In this particular diagram, it shows how the notification service interacts with research release event consumers. As envisioned, the notification service doesn't really do any processing of the reports. It would bundle any contextual information into report metadata, and that is really part of the event metadata. And they would use that, and SHARE would use the event metadata to create, as we're calling it, some channels of the notification stream to which consumers can subscribe. So if there was a specific set of activities, the events are stored in a digest, and then would be available for more flexible querying by the consumers. Okay, so since you said, oh, well, this is pretty raw metadata that you're sticking into this system, you're just sort of throwing it in there. One consumer would be perhaps the SHARE registry. The SHARE registry, well, the notification service would create or collect the research release events. The registry actually builds a sense of the works represented by these events. This would be where SHARE would sort out what specifically these events refer to. So that becomes sort of an information metadata stream, so that you could query the registry, get back more information using the notification elements, and get back more information about the research release event. So do you get it? That first of all, we're talking about just throwing out just a few pieces of information in this notification service. Then we'll have a registry be built that could be queried against, but also the registry would be fed by the notification service, so we would get information from that. I'm not the real technical person. I have one in the room if you really need questions, but this is what's said to be high level. So what happens when we start processing these events? Well, we have to think about different real-world use cases. Part of SHARE's long-term strategy is to perform this processing at our registry layer and then build this registry of resources based on the stream of event notifications. Then that would be tasked with determining the relationship between the various events and then doing some massaging of the event data. So that's where hard work would take place in this registry data. And that ties, again, back to this whole big picture of SHARE that is the multi-layer, multi-component one that I showed you earlier. The idea that there are components of this. And again, we began with the idea that the most important thing is to know that something has happened. And to know that something has happened in a small way that can then push us into systems that will get the more data that we need. So the question has come up, and it's been discussed already here, about our relationship to other community initiatives. And we often have gotten asked about how SHARE sometimes competes with COURSE, and I always get a kick out of that. And while SHARE has been concerned with federally funded research, as CORA certainly is, we also believe that developing this robust repository infrastructure in which our universities are already engaged. We have an incredible investment in repositories across many of our universities, and a variety of different kinds of research that is going on that is much broader than just the federally funded research. This would allow us to actually manage the assets of the university system in a much better way, and would make it possible for us to not only identify and preserve, but make them accessible for reading, mining, and reuse now and in the future. In some areas, such as the identifying the publication activity and alerting relevant stakeholders like federal agencies and Office of Sponsored Research, we do expect, and already you can know that SHARE and CORA have a very clear alignment of interests, and especially in identifiers. And as someone who sat on the very first NISO standard to develop the DOI, I personally have a strong interest in cross-ref. So there are certainly areas in which we both have interests, and working together can ensure that the Academy takes advantage of existing standards and infrastructures that make the whole system cost effective for everybody. Where the alignment occurs, we're certainly interacting in a manner that creates efficiencies for all stakeholders. In other areas where perhaps we disagree on some policy issues, alignment may not be possible, but in those instances, we'll advocate politely, but strongly in favor of solutions that favor the Academy. As I mentioned, that is our primary emphasis, is how we can ensure the strength of the Academy. We also get asked about ORCID and cross-ref, and of course, those definitely are other projects in which we have an interest and are strongly encouraging our members to make sure everybody's got an ORCID ID. And so now here's my chance to ask all of you, how many of you have an ORCID ID? Oh, not enough. Easy to do. Takes a few minutes. Just go in there and get your ORCID ID. So it's encouraging everybody who's written any paper, anywhere, get yourself an ORCID ID. It's very helpful. Also, of course, the cross-ref to take advantage of an existing infrastructure for article identification. And then internationally, SHARE has had a number of conversations with GIST, which is in the UK, Open Air in Europe, about how do we make sure, as Howard had mentioned, this is an international effort. The whole idea of research is not limited to a specific country. Nearly all of the researchers on our campuses have multiple relationships with multiple countries, and so we need to make sure that we are working collaboratively with all sorts of other large-scale efforts in terms of repositories and interoperability. So we have, in fact, created good working relationships to these other kinds of initiatives. So our long-term planning, in addition to as we build out the different layers and components for SHARE, the registry, the next to get some sort of idea for discovery, and then an aggregation which deals with the pulling together in order to be able to do the mining. We also have to think, as everybody does, about data. And that is another area in which SHARE is spending some interest and spending some time talking about, as everybody is, because of the very wide differences in the linking of and providing access to different forms of data. If we thought publications were difficult to deal with, data is much more complex. The other area that we have been working on, of course, is an intellectual property rights strategy that includes the promotion of university-based open access policies and favorable licensing terms. And that we definitely see as a necessary element in SHARE moving forward, because as I said in the very beginning, our institutional open access policies, other policies looking at favorable licensing will enable us to be able to fully realize an interoperable repository system across our campuses. So our communication folks are busy, and if you want to stay connected with SHARE or find out more about it, here are a variety of places. But one of the things I could comment on is that there are places for all sorts of participation in SHARE, and we'd love to hear from you as a community. Certainly manuscript submission systems are an element that can be helpful to SHARE, and we've had some preliminary conversations about that. So if any sort of stakeholder in this research ecosystem, whether you are yourself a researcher or publisher, funding officer, any other interested party, we do and would be interested in having you talk with us. So thank you very much.